There is a quiet contradiction in the human body that often goes unnoticed. In a world where survival has always depended on protection, most animals carry their shelter with them, woven directly into their skin as fur. It insulates, shields, and separates them from the outside, but humans do not. Our skin is exposed, sensitive to heat, cold, and injury, as if something essential has been removed. This absence does not feel like an advantage. It feels like a loss. And yet, this loss remained, and even deepened, across generations. No other large land animal followed the same path in quite the same way. So the question is not simply what was lost, but why that loss was never reversed. Why did humans lose their fur while other animals kept theirs? If we look across the natural world with a quiet and patient eye, a simple pattern begins to repeat itself. Bodies are covered, not perfectly, not uniformly, but consistently enough to feel like a rule that has been followed for a very long time. Fur appears in many forms, sometimes thick and insulating, sometimes light and barely visible, but almost always present. It rests over the skin as a first boundary, softening the contact between the body and the outside world. In colder regions, it becomes dense and layered, holding warmth close to the body. In warmer climates, it thins, but rarely disappears entirely. This continuity is not limited to one type of animal or one environment. It stretches across mammals of different sizes, different behaviors, and different habitats. Even animals that live under intense heat or move across open land often retain at least a minimal covering. Against this quiet consistency, the human body stands in contrast. The surface of the skin is mostly exposed, interrupted only by small and uneven patches of hair that do not serve the same protective role. This difference is easy to notice, but its meaning is less immediate. It does not clearly present itself as an advantage or a disadvantage. It simply exists as a deviation from what seems common across the rest of the living world. When early humans moved through their environments, their bodies would have interacted with the same elements as other animals around them. Sunlight, wind, dust, and temperature changes would have touched the skin directly, without the same buffer that fur provides. This is not a minor variation in appearance. It changes how the body meets the world at every moment, in ways that are constant but often unnoticed. The question that follows is not only about how this difference came to be, but why it remained across long stretches of time. In many species, traits that reduce survival tend to fade gradually. Traits that support survival tend to persist, even if they change slightly over generations. The near absence of body fur in humans suggests that it was not simply a random loss that stayed by chance. Something allowed it to continue even as generations passed through uncertain and often demanding conditions. To understand this, it helps to move slowly back toward earlier points in human history, when the line between human and non-human was less defined than it is today. Early members of the human lineage did not begin as hairless beings. Their bodies were more similar to other primates, with visible hair covering much of the skin. This places the change not at the beginning, but somewhere along the path of development. At some point, over many generations, the density of that covering began to shift. Not suddenly, and not completely at once, but gradually enough that each generation would have seemed continuous with the one before it. The environment during these periods was not stable or uniform. Climate patterns shifted over long timescales. Landscapes opened in some regions, and the conditions for movement changed. Forests that once offered shade and shelter gave way, in certain areas, to more open spaces with fewer natural barriers. In these settings, the body is no longer protected in the same way. Exposure becomes more constant, more direct, and more difficult to avoid. Under these conditions, the absence of fur does not immediately explain itself as useful. It creates a quiet tension that does not resolve easily. If most animals maintain this layer, and if it serves so many functions across different environments, then why does the human body stand apart in this way? And if this difference began somewhere in the deep past, why was it not reversed, but instead carried forward into every human body that exists today, across climates, cultures, and generations? If the human body appears unusual when compared to other animals, that difference becomes even clearer when attention shifts from what is seen to what is felt. Skin, when uncovered, does not remain neutral. It responds continuously to the environment, often in ways that require adjustment. A brief change in temperature can be noticed almost immediately. Cold air creates a tightening sensation, sometimes followed by a subtle loss of warmth that spreads inward. Heat, in contrast, builds on the surface, pressing against the skin until the body begins to react. This constant exchange between the body and its surroundings is not unique to humans, but the intensity of that exchange is. Without a thick layer of fur, there is very little distance between the external world and the inner systems that regulate balance. This creates a condition where the body must remain active, even at rest, simply to maintain stability. In many other mammals, fur acts as a passive layer. It does not require constant adjustment. It holds warmth when needed and reduces the impact of sudden changes. The animal beneath it does not experience every shift in the same direct way. For humans, the experience is different. Exposure becomes part of the baseline condition. The skin is not only a surface, but a boundary that is always in use. This may seem ordinary, because it is familiar, but when placed beside the rest of the natural world, it begins to appear less expected. If early humans shared similar environments with other animals, this difference would have shaped their daily experience in quiet but continuous ways. Moving through open land without a protective covering would mean that sunlight reached the skin directly for long periods of time. Wind would not be filtered. Dust and small particles would make contact more easily. During colder periods, the absence of insulation would require either movement or shelter to maintain warmth. This suggests that the human body, as it is now, is not fully independent from its surroundings. It requires interaction, adjustment, and sometimes external support. From a biological perspective, this raises a careful question. If a trait creates ongoing exposure and requires continuous regulation, why would it persist? In many cases, traits that increase vulnerability tend to be reduced over long periods of time. Yet in humans, the reduction of body hair did not reverse. Instead, it became consistent across populations, even as humans moved into different climates and regions. This continuity suggests that the experience of exposure, while noticeable, may not have been purely disadvantageous. It may have been part of a broader shift in how the body interacted with its environment. To understand this more clearly, it helps to return again to earlier stages of human development. The ancestors of humans did not begin with exposed skin. They began with a covering more similar to that of other primates. The gradual reduction of that covering implies a transition that unfolded slowly, without a single defining moment. Each small change would have been carried forward only if it did not prevent survival. Over time, what once may have been a variation became a defining feature. Still, at this stage, the reason remains unresolved. The human body feels more exposed, more reactive, and in some ways more dependent on its surroundings than many other animals. This creates a quiet tension that does not resolve on its own. If the body experiences more direct contact with the environment, and if that contact requires constant adjustment, then what condition made this state not only possible, but stable across generations? If the human body feels exposed in ways that seem unusual, it becomes necessary to look more closely at what fur actually does, beyond the simple idea of warmth. Fur is not a single-purpose feature. It performs several roles at once, often without drawing attention to itself. It creates a thin but important layer between the body and the environment, reducing the speed at which heat is lost or gained. It also protects the skin from direct contact with small abrasions, insects, and particles in the air. In many mammals, it even plays a role in sensing, as individual hairs can respond to movement and subtle changes in the surroundings. This means that fur is not only about insulation, it is part of a broader system that supports stability, protection, and awareness. When this system is reduced or removed, the change is not isolated. It affects how the body regulates temperature, how it interacts with physical contact, and how it responds to the environment in quiet, continuous ways. From this perspective, the near absence of fur in humans begins to appear less like a minor variation and more like a significant shift in how the body is structured. It suggests that multiple functions were altered at once, rather than just one. In many animals, losing such a feature would create immediate challenges. Without insulation, maintaining body temperature becomes more difficult. Without protection, the skin becomes more vulnerable to injury and irritation. Without the subtle sensory input from hair, awareness of nearby movement may be reduced. These are not small adjustments. They are changes that would normally place pressure on a species, especially in environments that are not controlled or predictable. Yet in the human case, this reduction did not lead to disappearance. It persisted, gradually becoming a defining trait. This persistence suggests that the change was either neutral enough not to be selected against, or connected to other changes that balanced its effects. To understand how this could happen, it is helpful to return once more to earlier stages of human evolution. The ancestors of humans, like other primates, had bodies that were more fully covered. This places the origin of the change somewhere along the evolutionary path, not at the beginning. Over many generations, the density and distribution of body hair began to shift. The process was slow, without a clear boundary where one form ended and another began. Each generation would have carried only a small difference, one that might not have been noticeable within a single lifetime. At the same time, the environments these early humans inhabited were also changing. Forested areas that once provided shade and natural protection were, in some regions, replaced by more open landscapes. In these settings, the functions of fur may not have operated in the same way as before. A layer that once helped retain warmth might begin to interact differently with constant sunlight and movement. Still, this does not immediately explain why such a change would be maintained. It only deepens the question. If fur serves multiple roles that support survival, and if removing it affects several systems at once, then the continued absence of fur in humans points toward a broader shift, one that involves not just the surface of the body, but the way the body functions within its environment. What kind of conditions could make the loss of such a multifunctional feature not only possible, but sustainable over long periods of time without being reversed? If the absence of fur in the human body feels like a loss when viewed from the outside, that feeling becomes more complex when we begin to understand what fur actually does. It is easy to think of fur as something simple, a layer that keeps an animal warm, but this view is only a small part of a larger system. In many mammals, fur works quietly across several functions at once, without needing active control. It helps regulate the exchange of heat between the body and the environment, slowing down both cooling and overheating. It also reduces direct contact between the skin and the outside world, softening the effects of friction, small impacts, and environmental particles. In addition, individual hairs can respond to movement, allowing the body to detect subtle changes in the surroundings, such as air shifts or nearby motion. These roles are not separate. They operate together, forming a stable interface between the organism and its environment. When this interface is reduced, the body must compensate in other ways. For early humans, this would not have been a single change, but a gradual adjustment across multiple systems. Without a dense layer of fur, the skin becomes more directly involved in temperature regulation. Heat can be lost or gained more quickly, depending on the surrounding conditions. This means the body must respond more actively, rather than relying on a passive insulating layer. It also means that the skin becomes a more exposed surface, taking on a larger role in protection and interaction. Small variations in the environment are felt more directly, and the body must adjust more frequently to maintain balance. This creates a different relationship between the organism and its surroundings, one that is less buffered and more immediate. If we return again to earlier stages of human development, the shift becomes clearer. The ancestors of humans did not begin with this exposed condition. Their bodies were more similar to other primates, with a visible and functional covering of hair. This suggests that the reduction of fur was not part of the original design, but something that emerged over time. The process was likely slow, unfolding across many generations, with each change small enough not to disrupt survival. At the same time, the environments these early humans inhabited were not static. Changes in climate and landscape altered the conditions under which the body operated. In more open environments, with increased exposure to sunlight and longer distances to travel, the role of fur may have shifted. A layer that once helped retain warmth in shaded forest conditions might interact differently under direct sun. Still, this does not immediately resolve the question. Fur provides multiple benefits across a wide range of environments, and many animals retain it even under conditions that differ greatly from those of early primates. The reduction of fur in humans, therefore, suggests that other factors were at play, factors that either reduce the need for these functions or replace them in different ways. It is important not to assume that the loss of fur was a direct improvement. Evolution does not always move toward what appears most complete or most protected. It moves through changes that are simply sustainable within a given context. The human body, with its exposed skin, reflects a set of conditions in which the functions of fur were either altered, redistributed, or made less central to survival. This does not remove the sense of vulnerability that comes with exposure. It only places that vulnerability within a broader system, one that allowed it to persist. If fur is more than warmth, and if losing it affects multiple layers of function, then the continued absence of fur in humans points toward a deeper shift, one that cannot be explained by a single cause, but must be understood through the interaction of environment, physiology, and time. If fur supports several functions at once, then removing it does not simply take away warmth. It alters a balance that has been maintained across many mammalian bodies for a very long time. When that balance shifts, the body does not remain unchanged. It must adjust, either by strengthening other systems or by changing how it interacts with the environment. In humans, the reduction of fur appears alongside a set of other features that begin to take on greater importance. The skin, for example, becomes more than a passive surface. It becomes an active site of regulation. One of the most widely observed changes is the increased presence of sweat glands across the human body. These glands allow heat to be released through evaporation, a process that becomes especially effective when the surface of the skin is not blocked by dense hair. This does not mean that fur was simply replaced by sweating, but it suggests that a different method of managing heat became more central. In many mammals, cooling is achieved through limited areas of the body, such as panting or localized sweating. In humans, the distribution is broader, and the process is more continuous. This creates a body that interacts with heat in a different way, one that depends less on retaining warmth and more on releasing it when necessary. At the same time, this shift introduces new conditions. A body that loses heat more easily must also manage the risk of losing too much, especially when temperatures drop or when the body is not in motion. This reinforces the idea that the change was not a simple improvement, but a trade-off. To understand why such a trade-off could persist, it is helpful to consider how early humans may have moved through their environments. Evidence from skeletal structure and comparative studies suggests that early members of the human lineage were capable of sustained movement over longer distances than many other animals. This type of movement does not rely on short bursts of speed, but on endurance over time. In such conditions, the ability to release heat efficiently becomes more important than the ability to retain it. A body covered in dense fur may overheat during prolonged activity under direct sunlight, especially in open landscapes. A body with reduced fur, combined with effective sweating, may be better able to maintain a stable internal temperature during extended movement. This does not imply a single behavior or a fixed way of life, but it provides a context in which the loss of fur could be maintained without reducing survival. Returning again to the earlier stages of human development, the environments in which these changes occurred were not uniform. Some regions became more open, with less shade and more exposure to sunlight. Movement across these landscapes would have required both energy and regulation. The body would need to manage heat not only during rest, but during activity that could last for extended periods. In this context, the interaction between skin, sweat, and exposure begins to form a system that differs from the one supported by fur. Still, this system is not without its limits. The absence of fur means that the body must remain engaged with its surroundings, adjusting continuously to changes in temperature and condition. It cannot rely on a stable insulating layer. This suggests that the persistence of reduced fur was not the result of a single advantage, but of a broader alignment between the body and the conditions in which it operated. The change did not remove the challenges associated with exposure. It reshaped them, placing the body in a different relationship with heat, movement, and the environment over time. If the human body replaced some of the functions of fur with other systems, it becomes important to understand how complete that replacement really is. The presence of widespread sweating and a more exposed skin surface suggests a shift in how heat is managed, but it does not fully recreate the layered roles that fur once provided. Instead, it creates a different balance, one that solves certain problems while introducing others. When sweat evaporates from the surface of the skin, it carries heat away from the body. This process can be highly effective under conditions where air movement and dryness allow evaporation to occur. However, it also depends on the availability of water within the body. Sweating is not a passive feature. It requires continuous fluid loss, and this loss must be replaced. In environments where water is limited or where evaporation is less efficient, this system becomes more demanding. Fur, by contrast, does not rely on internal resources in the same way. It functions as a stable layer, requiring no ongoing input to maintain its insulating properties. This difference highlights a broader shift in how the human body manages its relationship with the environment. The regulation of temperature becomes more active, more dependent on conditions, and more closely tied to behavior. In addition to temperature, the protective role of fur must also be considered. Fur can reduce the impact of small injuries, limit direct exposure to sunlight, and create a barrier against insects and external irritants. When this layer is reduced, the skin takes on a greater burden. In humans, the skin is not left unchanged in response. It develops features such as increased pigmentation in certain populations, which can help reduce the effects of prolonged sunlight exposure. This suggests that the loss of fur was accompanied by adjustments in other areas, rather than occurring in isolation. Still, these adjustments do not fully replicate the original functions of fur. They represent alternative solutions, each with their own limitations. If we return again to earlier points in human history, the pattern becomes clearer. The reduction of fur appears to have taken place gradually, alongside changes in environment, movement, and physiology. It was not a single event, but a process that unfolded over long periods of time. During this process, each small change would have been carried forward only if it did not prevent survival. This means that the body did not need to become perfect in its new form. It only needed to remain viable within the conditions it faced. Over many generations, the combination of reduced fur, increased sweating, and other physiological changes created a body that functioned differently from that of other mammals. This difference did not remove vulnerability, it reorganized it. Exposure became a constant feature, but one that could be managed through a combination of biological and behavioral responses. The human body, in this sense, does not replace fur with an equivalent structure. It transitions into a different mode of interaction with the environment, one that relies on active regulation rather than passive protection. This raises a final consideration. If the loss of fur was not fully compensated by a single replacement, then its persistence suggests that the overall system, despite its demands, was stable enough to endure. The human body, as it developed, became part of a larger pattern of adaptation, where multiple changes supported each other, even if none of them alone would have been sufficient. The absence of fur, therefore, is not a single story of loss or gain. It is one part of a broader shift, one that continues to shape how the human body experiences and responds to the world around it. If the human body did not lose its fur all at once, and if that loss was connected to a broader shift in how the body functioned, then it becomes necessary to look beyond the body itself and toward the conditions in which that change unfolded. The environment is not a fixed backdrop. It changes over long periods of time, sometimes gradually, sometimes in ways that reshape entire regions. For early human ancestors, these changes were not abstract. They altered the ground beneath their movement, the availability of shade, and the patterns of temperature throughout the day. In earlier periods, many primates lived within forested environments where trees provided a layered structure. The canopy reduced direct sunlight, and the ground below remained relatively sheltered. In such settings, fur could support both insulation and protection without creating excessive heat. Movement was often shorter, more contained, and closely tied to the structure of the forest. Over time, however, some of these environments began to open. Forests receded in certain regions, giving way to more expansive landscapes with fewer natural barriers. These spaces exposed the body to direct sunlight for longer periods, while also increasing the distances between resources such as water and food. Movement in these environments would not be limited to short intervals. It would extend across longer stretches of land, often under conditions that placed continuous demands on the body. In this context, the interaction between the body and heat begins to change. Under direct sunlight, a thick layer of fur can trap heat close to the skin especially during prolonged activity. While this may be manageable in shaded environments, it becomes more challenging in open spaces where exposure is constant. A body that retains too much heat may be forced to reduce movement or seek shelter more frequently. A body that can release heat more efficiently may be able to continue moving for longer periods without reaching the same level of strain. This does not suggest that the loss of fur was a simple response to a single environmental factor. It suggests that the conditions in which early humans lived began to favor different balances between protection and regulation. Returning again to earlier stages of human development, the transition from more forested to more open environments did not occur everywhere at once. It varied across regions and over time. This means that the changes in the human body were likely shaped by a range of conditions, not a single uniform landscape. Still, in areas where exposure to sunlight increased and movement became more extended, the ability to manage heat would have become more important. The reduction of fur, combined with other physiological changes, may have supported this shift. Even if it introduced new challenges, the absence of a protective layer would mean greater exposure to the elements, requiring the body to respond more actively. This reinforces the idea that the human body did not become less dependent on its environment. It became dependent in a different way. Instead of relying on a stable barrier like fur, it relied on processes that required constant adjustment, such as sweating and behavioral changes. These processes do not operate independently. They are influenced by movement, access to water, and the timing of activity. This creates a system in which the body and the environment are closely linked, each shaping the conditions of the other. The shift in environment, therefore, does not provide a complete answer, but it offers a setting in which the loss of fur becomes more understandable. It places the change within a broader pattern where the structure of the landscape, the intensity of sunlight, and the need for sustained movement all interact with the biology of the body. Within this pattern, the absence of fur is not an isolated feature. It is part of a larger transition, one that reflects how early humans moved, lived, and adapted across changing environments over time. As the environment opened and shade became less consistent, the daily rhythm of movement began to change in ways that are not immediately visible, but deeply influential. In forested settings, activity could be distributed throughout the day with some natural protection from direct sunlight. The canopy filtered light, softened temperature shifts, and created a more stable range of conditions. In more open landscapes, this balance no longer held. Sunlight reached the ground without interruption, and temperature differences between morning, midday, and evening became more pronounced. This created periods of the day when movement would be easier, and others when it would be more difficult. For a body covered in dense fur, extended activity under direct sunlight could lead to a gradual buildup of heat. This does not happen instantly, but over time, as the body continues to generate heat through movement while also absorbing it from the environment. Without an efficient way to release that heat, the internal balance begins to shift. The body may need to slow down, rest, or seek shade to prevent further increase. For early humans moving across open land, such interruptions could shape how far they could travel and how long they could remain active. A body that could continue moving under these conditions, even if not at high speed, would experience the environment differently. This does not imply constant motion, but it suggests a form of activity that is sustained rather than brief. In this context, the interaction between skin, sweat, and airflow becomes more relevant. When the surface of the skin is exposed, and when air moves across it, heat can be released more gradually through evaporation. This process does not remove the challenge of heat, but it changes how the body responds to it. Instead of reaching a limit quickly, the body may be able to maintain a more stable condition over a longer period. Returning again to earlier stages of human development, these patterns of movement would not have been identical across all regions. Some groups may have remained in more sheltered environments, while others moved into areas with greater exposure. The bodies of these populations would have responded to their conditions over many generations, with small differences accumulating over time. The reduction of fur in this setting can be seen as part of a broader alignment between the body and patterns of activity. It does not remove the need for rest or shelter, but it may shift when and how those needs arise. At the same time, this change introduces new forms of sensitivity. Without fur, the skin becomes more directly affected by the intensity of sunlight. Prolonged exposure can lead to damage, which the body must then manage through other means. This suggests that the loss of fur did not eliminate environmental pressures, it transformed them. The body moved from one set of constraints to another, each requiring different forms of response. The absence of fur, therefore, is not only about temperature, it is also about timing, movement, and the way the body navigates cycles of exposure and recovery. This creates a pattern in which behavior becomes closely linked to biological capacity. The body is no longer shielded in the same way, but it may be able to operate differently within the same environment. If early humans were adapting to landscapes where movement across open ground was more common, then the balance between retaining heat and releasing it would have become a central concern. In that balance, the reduction of fur may not appear as a simple advantage, but as part of a system that allowed certain forms of activity to continue under conditions that would otherwise limit them. As these patterns of movement and exposure continued across long stretches of time, the relationship between the human body and its environment became more tightly connected to the idea of endurance rather than short bursts of effort. In many animals, survival often depends on speed, strength, or the ability to escape quickly. These forms of movement rely on brief periods of intense activity followed by rest. In such conditions, retaining body heat through fur does not create the same level of strain because the activity does not last long enough for heat to accumulate in a critical way. For early humans moving across more open landscapes, the pattern appears different. The ability to continue moving at a steady pace over extended periods may have been more relevant than the ability to move quickly for a short time. This type of movement places a different demand on the body. Heat is not generated all at once, but gradually, building over time as muscles remain active and energy continues to be used. In this setting, the problem is not a sudden rise in temperature, but a slow and continuous increase that must be managed to prevent imbalance. Without an effective way to release this heat, the body would eventually reach a point where continued movement becomes difficult. This is where the absence of dense fur begins to take on a different meaning. A more exposed skin surface allows heat to be released more steadily, especially when combined with the process of sweating. As air moves across the skin, it supports evaporation, carrying heat away in a way that can continue as long as movement continues. This does not eliminate the limits of the body, but it changes where those limits appear. Instead of being reached quickly, they may be extended over a longer period. Returning again to earlier stages of human history, the environments in which these patterns emerged were not uniform, but they shared certain features. Open spaces, variable temperatures, and the need to travel between resources would have shaped how the body was used. In such conditions, the capacity to remain active for longer durations could influence access to food, water, and shelter. This does not imply a single behavior or a fixed strategy, but it provides a context in which endurance becomes a meaningful factor. The reduction of fur within this context can be seen as part of a broader shift toward a body that manages heat through release rather than retention. At the same time, this shift does not remove the presence of risk. A body that loses heat more easily must also contend with periods when heat is not available, such as during cooler nights or in changing weather conditions. This reinforces the idea that the change was not a simple improvement, but a reorganization of how the body interacts with its environment over time. The human body, as it develops along this path, becomes less insulated but more responsive. It does not carry a stable protective layer in the same way as many other animals. Instead, it relies on ongoing processes that adjust to conditions as they change. This creates a form of dependence that is not immediately visible, but consistently present. The absence of fur, therefore, is not only connected to the environment itself, but to the way the body moves within it. It reflects a pattern in which sustained activity, gradual heat buildup, and continuous regulation are linked together. Within this pattern, the loss of fur does not stand alone. It is part of a larger transition, one that aligns the human body with a different rhythm of movement, exposure, and adaptation across time. If the human body became more dependent on releasing heat rather than retaining it, then the mechanisms that support this shift must be understood more carefully. One of the most noticeable features of the human body, when compared to other mammals, is the widespread presence of sweat glands across the skin. These glands are not unique to humans, but their distribution and activity are. In many animals, sweating is limited to specific areas or plays a minor role in temperature control. Cooling is often achieved through other means, such as panting or seeking shade. In humans, however, sweating becomes a central process, one that operates continuously under the right conditions. When the body begins to warm, sweat is released onto the surface of the skin. As it evaporates, it carries heat away, allowing the internal temperature to remain within a stable range. This process does not require sudden effort. It unfolds gradually, adjusting to the level of activity in the surrounding environment. The effectiveness of this system depends on exposure. If the skin is covered by a dense layer of fur, evaporation becomes less efficient, as air cannot move freely across the surface. Without that barrier, the interaction between skin, air, and moisture becomes more direct. This suggests that the reduction of fur and the development of sweating are not separate changes, but part of a connected pattern. Each supports the function of the other, even if neither fully replaces what was lost. Returning again to earlier stages of human evolution, the emergence of this pattern would not have occurred in isolation. As environments shifted and movement patterns changed, the body would have been shaped by the need to manage heat over longer periods. A system based on evaporation would allow for continued activity without rapid overheating, especially in open landscapes where shade is limited. This does not imply that early humans were constantly active, but it suggests that their bodies were capable of sustaining activity under conditions that would challenge other mammals. At the same time, this system introduces new dependencies. Sweating requires water. The body must maintain a balance between losing heat and losing fluids. In environments where water is not immediately available, this creates a constraint that did not exist in the same way for animals relying on passive insulation. The human body, therefore, becomes part of a cycle that includes not only temperature and movement, but also access to resources. This reinforces the idea that the loss of fur did not simplify the relationship between the body and its environment. It made that relationship more dynamic, more dependent on timing and availability. The skin, in this system, is not simply exposed. It becomes an active surface, one that participates in maintaining internal stability. Small changes in airflow, humidity, and temperature all influence how effectively heat can be released. This creates a body that is responsive, but also sensitive. It does not carry a constant layer of protection. Instead, it adjusts continuously, using processes that are effective under certain conditions and less so under others. The persistence of this system across generations suggests that, within the environments where early humans lived, it was sufficient. It did not eliminate all challenges, but it allowed the body to function within a specific range of conditions. The absence of fur in this context is not an isolated trait. It is part of a broader configuration, one in which the regulation of heat is managed through exposure, evaporation, and movement rather than through insulation alone. If sweating became central to how the human body manages heat, then the structure of the skin itself begins to take on a different role than it does in most other mammals. Skin is no longer only a surface that protects what lies beneath. It becomes part of a system that must remain active, responsive, and continuously engaged with the environment. Beneath the surface, networks of blood vessels expand and contract to regulate how much heat is carried toward the outer layer. When the body warms, these vessels widen, allowing more heat to move outward, where it can be released. When the body cools, they narrow, conserving warmth by limiting that flow. This process, combined with sweating, creates a form of temperature control that depends on constant adjustment rather than a fixed barrier. In animals with dense fur, much of this regulation is buffered. The fur slows the exchange between the body and the outside world, reducing the need for rapid internal changes. In humans, the absence of such a layer means that these internal systems must work more actively, responding to even small shifts in the environment. This creates a body that is finely tuned, but also more directly exposed. Returning again to earlier stages of human history, this kind of system would have interacted closely with patterns of movement and rest. A body that relies on active cooling does not remain in a steady state. It shifts depending on whether it is in motion, whether it is in sunlight or shade, and how much moisture is available for evaporation. During extended movement, heat is generated continuously, and the body must release it at a similar rate to maintain balance. When movement slows or stops, the same system must adjust, reducing heat loss to prevent cooling too quickly. This constant transition requires coordination across multiple processes, all of which depend on the condition of the skin. The surface becomes a point of exchange, where internal and external conditions meet. At the same time, this system is influenced by the properties of the surrounding air. In dry conditions, sweat can evaporate more easily, allowing heat to be released efficiently. In more humid environments, evaporation slows, and the same amount of sweat may not produce the same cooling effect. This means that the effectiveness of the system is not fixed. It varies depending on location, climate, and time of day. For early humans, moving through different regions, this would have created a shifting landscape of conditions, each requiring a slightly different response. The reduction of fur, in this context, does not provide a single advantage across all environments. It interacts with local conditions in ways that can either support or challenge the body's ability to maintain balance. This reinforces the idea that the human body did not become less dependent on its surroundings. It became dependent in a more flexible, but also more demanding way. The absence of a stable insulating layer means that the body must remain engaged with its environment at all times, adjusting through processes that are effective only under certain conditions. This creates a form of vulnerability that is not always visible, but is always present. If we consider again the broader pattern of human evolution, this system appears alongside other changes that support sustained activity and adaptation to open landscapes. The skin, the circulatory system, and the processes of heat exchange all work together, forming a configuration that differs from that of most other mammals. Within this configuration, the loss of fur is not a single change, but part of a larger reorganization, one that shifts the balance from passive protection to active regulation. If the human body relies on exposed skin, sweating, and internal regulation to manage heat, then it becomes necessary to consider how stable this system truly is across different conditions. A system built on active processes does not operate in the same way as one built on passive insulation. It requires timing, resources, and a certain alignment between the body and the environment. When these elements are present, the system can function with quiet efficiency. When they are not, its limits begin to appear more clearly. One of the most important of these limits is the reliance on water. Sweating allows heat to leave the body, but it does so by removing fluid. Over time, this loss must be replaced. If it is not, the body's ability to regulate temperature begins to weaken. This introduces a constraint that is not always visible but always present. In contrast, fur does not depend on a continuous input. It remains in place regardless of access to resources. The human system, therefore, trades stability for flexibility. It can respond dynamically to heat, but only within a range supported by hydration and environmental conditions. Returning again to earlier stages of human development, this dependence would have shaped patterns of movement and behavior. Access to water sources would become closely tied to periods of activity. Movement across open landscapes would need to account not only for distance and terrain, but for the availability of resources that support the body's internal balance. This does not imply a fixed route or a single strategy, but it suggests that the body and its environment were linked through cycles of movement, exposure, and recovery. The absence of fur, in this context, becomes part of a system that requires coordination rather than providing constant protection. At the same time, this system is influenced by the rhythm of the day. Under direct sunlight, the need to release heat increases, and the processes of sweating and circulation become more active. As the sun lowers and temperatures drop, the same body must conserve heat more carefully. Without a thick insulating layer, this transition can be more immediate. The skin that once released heat must now limit its loss. This creates a body that moves between states, adjusting to changing conditions rather than remaining within a narrow range. Such a system can be effective, but it is not without tension. It depends on the body's ability to shift smoothly between different modes of regulation. If we consider again the broader arc of human evolution, this pattern suggests that the loss of fur did not simplify the body's relationship with its environment. It made that relationship more complex. The body no longer carries a stable barrier that moderates change. Instead, it participates directly in that change, responding through processes that require energy, coordination, and resources. This creates a form of adaptation that is less visible than a physical covering, but no less significant. The human body becomes a system that manages exposure rather than avoiding it. The skin, the circulation, and the availability of water all become part of a continuous exchange with the environment. Within this exchange, the absence of fur is not a gap left unfilled. It is part of a different arrangement, one that allows the body to operate under certain conditions while remaining sensitive to others. The persistence of this arrangement suggests that, despite its demands, it provided a workable balance across the environments in which early humans lived. It did not remove vulnerability, but it reshaped how that vulnerability was experienced and managed over time. If the human body developed a way to release heat more effectively, then it becomes possible to consider how this ability connects to movement over time. Movement is not only about speed or strength, it also depends on how long the body can continue without reaching a limit that forces it to stop. In many animals, this limit is reached quickly, during intense activity. Muscles generate heat, the body temperature rises, and without an efficient way to release that heat, the animal must pause, slow down, or seek shelter. This creates a pattern of movement that is often brief and intermittent. In contrast, a body that can release heat more steadily may not reach that limit as quickly. It may be able to continue at a moderate pace for a longer duration, even if it is not capable of high speed. This difference, while subtle at first, can change how the body interacts with its environment over extended periods. Returning again to earlier stages of human history, some evidence suggests that early humans were capable of sustained movement across open landscapes. This type of movement does not depend on sudden bursts, but on consistency. The body remains active, generating heat gradually, while also releasing it through the surface of the skin. The absence of dense fur allows air to move more freely across that surface, supporting evaporation and cooling. This creates a condition in which the body can maintain a balance between heat production and heat loss over longer periods. It does not remove fatigue, but it delays the point at which heat alone becomes the limiting factor. In this context, the reduction of fur begins to connect with a broader pattern of endurance. A body that can remain active for longer may access resources that are spread across larger distances. It may also operate during times of day when other animals are less active due to heat. This does not imply a single behavior or a fixed strategy, but it provides a framework in which sustained movement becomes meaningful. At the same time, this ability is not without cost. A body that depends on continuous cooling must also manage the loss of fluids and the risk of overheating if conditions change. This reinforces the idea that the shift is not a simple improvement, but a rebalancing of strengths and limitations. If we consider again the environments in which early humans lived, the combination of open spaces, variable temperatures, and dispersed resources would have created conditions where endurance could influence survival. Movement across such landscapes would not always be fast, but it would need to be persistent. In this setting, the ability to regulate heat effectively becomes closely tied to the ability to continue moving. The loss of fur, therefore, can be seen not only as a change in protection, but as part of a system that supports a different pattern of activity. The human body, in this sense, is not designed for a single form of movement. It is capable of adapting its pace, maintaining effort over time, and adjusting to conditions as they change. This creates a form of interaction with the environment that is less about immediate response and more about continuity. The absence of fur contributes to this by allowing heat to be released more steadily, even if it also increases exposure. The balance that emerges is not one of maximum efficiency in all situations, but one that remains workable across a range of conditions. Within this balance, the human body becomes aligned with movement that extends through time, rather than movement that is defined by brief intensity. If sustained movement became part of how early humans interacted with their environment, then it is necessary to consider how this form of activity differs from the patterns seen in many other mammals. Movement over long distances does not depend only on muscles and energy. It also depends on how the body manages heat as that movement continues. In animals that rely on speed, the body generates a large amount of heat in a short period. Once the activity ends, cooling can take place during rest. This creates a cycle of effort and recovery that repeats. In contrast, a body that remains in motion for longer durations must manage heat while the activity is still ongoing. It cannot rely entirely on rest to restore balance. This places a different demand on the systems that regulate temperature. The body must release heat at a rate that keeps pace with its production, or at least prevents it from rising beyond a manageable range. In humans, the combination of exposed skin and widespread sweating allows this process to continue gradually, without requiring a complete stop in movement. This does not remove fatigue or the need for rest, but it changes when and why rest becomes necessary. Returning again to earlier stages of human development, this pattern of movement may have influenced how early humans approached the search for food and other resources. Instead of depending solely on sudden action, there may have been situations where persistence played a role. Movement across open land, under steady sunlight, would have required the body to maintain its internal balance over extended periods. A body that could continue moving under these conditions, even at a moderate pace, would experience the landscape differently from one that needed frequent pauses due to heat buildup. This does not suggest a single universal behavior, but it offers a context in which endurance becomes relevant. The reduction of fur, within this context, supports a body that can release heat more effectively while in motion. At the same time, this creates a dependence on conditions that allow cooling to occur. Air movement, temperature, and access to water all influence how well the system functions. This means that the ability to sustain movement is not fixed. It varies depending on the environment and the state of the body. If the air is still, or if humidity is high, evaporation slows, and the same effort may lead to a different outcome. This reinforces the idea that the human body does not operate independently of its surroundings. It responds to them continuously, adjusting its activity to match what is possible. The absence of fur, therefore, is not simply a feature that enables endurance. It is part of a broader system that makes endurance possible under certain conditions while limiting it under others. If we consider again the longer arc of human evolution, this pattern suggests that the body was shaped not only by what it could do in brief moments, but by what it could maintain over time. The interaction between heat production, heat release, and movement creates a rhythm that extends beyond immediate action. Within this rhythm, the loss of fur is not an isolated change. It is one element in a configuration that supports continuity of movement, even as it introduces new constraints. The human body, in this sense, becomes a system that manages effort across time, rather than concentrating it into short intervals. The balance it achieves is not perfect, but it is sufficient to allow sustained activity in environments where such activity could influence survival. If the human body can maintain movement over longer periods while releasing heat, then it becomes possible to consider how this ability shapes the limits of the body in a different way. Limits do not disappear. They shift. In many animals, the limit appears quickly during intense activity, when heat rises faster than it can be released. The body reaches a point where continuing would create imbalance, and so it stops. In humans, the limit may appear more gradually. Heat builds more slowly, and it is released more steadily, allowing the body to continue moving for longer before reaching the same threshold. This does not make the body stronger in a simple sense. It makes it capable of operating within a different pattern, one where endurance becomes more central than speed. Returning again to earlier stages of human history, this pattern would have interacted with the structure of the environment. Open landscapes, with scattered resources and variable conditions, do not always support quick, decisive actions. They often require movement that extends across time, with periods of effort that are less intense but more sustained. In such settings, the ability to continue moving, even when conditions are not ideal, may influence access to food, water, and shelter. This does not imply a single method or behavior, but it provides a context in which endurance can shape outcomes in subtle ways. The reduction of fur within this context becomes part of a system that supports this kind of movement. By allowing heat to be released more efficiently, it delays the point at which the body must stop due to overheating. At the same time, this delay is not unlimited. The body still accumulates fatigue, still loses fluids, and still depends on conditions that allow cooling to occur. The difference lies in how these limits are reached. They are not immediate. They emerge over time, influenced by the balance between heat production and heat release. This creates a form of movement that is continuous, rather than fragmented into short bursts. If we consider again the broader pattern of human adaptation, this continuity may have allowed early humans to interact with their environment in ways that differ from many other animals. Movement could be extended across distances that would otherwise require multiple pauses, Activity could continue under conditions that might limit others more quickly. This does not remove the presence of risk, but it redistributes it. The body becomes less constrained by rapid overheating, but more dependent on maintaining balance over time. The absence of fur, therefore, contributes to a system that is not defined by immediate performance, but by sustained capacity. It allows the body to remain active within a certain range, even as that range depends on external factors such as temperature, airflow, and water availability. This reinforces the idea that the human body is not insulated from its environment, but deeply connected to it. Its abilities emerge from this connection rather than from separation. Within this framework, the loss of fur is not simply a removal of protection. It is part of a reorganization, one that aligns the body with a different set of constraints and possibilities. The human body becomes a system that manages its limits across time, adjusting continuously rather than reacting only at the point of strain. In this way, endurance is not a single trait, but a pattern that emerges from the interaction between physiology, environment, and movement. If the loss of fur helped extend the body's ability to move without overheating, it also brought forward a different set of vulnerabilities that are not immediately visible when movement is the focus. Without a dense layer covering the skin, the body becomes more directly exposed to sunlight. This exposure is not only about warmth, it involves a range of effects that accumulate over time, especially in environments where the sun remains strong for long periods. When light reaches the skin without a protective layer, it carries energy that can alter the outer and deeper layers in gradual ways. This does not always produce immediate discomfort. It can unfold slowly, with effects that only become noticeable after repeated exposure. In many mammals, fur reduces the intensity of this contact. It reflects some of the incoming light and creates a space between the surface and the skin beneath. In humans, that space is largely absent. The skin must respond more directly. One of the most widely observed responses is the presence of pigmentation, which varies across populations and environments. Pigmentation is not evenly distributed across all humans. It reflects a long process of adjustment, shaped by the conditions in which different groups lived. In regions with stronger and more consistent sunlight, darker pigmentation is more common. In regions with lower levels of sunlight, lighter pigmentation appears more frequently. This variation suggests that the body did not remain unchanged after the reduction of fur. It developed additional ways to manage the effects of exposure. These changes do not replace the functions of fur entirely. They offer a different form of protection, one that operates at the level of the skin itself. Returning again to earlier stages of human history, this adjustment would have taken place over many generations, as populations moved and settled in environments with different levels of sunlight. The body did not adopt a single solution that worked everywhere. Instead, it shifted gradually, responding to local conditions. This reinforces the idea that the loss of fur was not a complete transformation in itself, but part of a series of changes that continued over time. At the same time, the absence of fur introduces other forms of exposure. The skin is more susceptible to small injuries, to changes in temperature, and to contact with external elements. These effects are not always severe, but they are continuous. The body must manage them as part of its normal function. This suggests that the human system, while capable of releasing heat effectively, does not eliminate risk. It reorganizes it. Protection is no longer provided by a single external layer. It is distributed across multiple processes, each addressing a different aspect of exposure. If we consider again the broader pattern of human adaptation, this shift reflects a balance that is not fixed. The body gains certain capacities, such as extended movement and heat release, while also taking on new forms of sensitivity. The absence of fur, therefore, cannot be understood as a simple gain or loss. It is part of a larger transition, one in which the body becomes more directly engaged with its environment. The skin, rather than being shielded, becomes a site of interaction, responding to light, temperature, and contact in ways that are both protective and vulnerable. This creates a condition where the body must continuously adjust, not only to maintain internal balance, but to manage the ongoing effects of exposure. If the skin became the primary surface through which the human body interacts with sunlight, then the effects of that exposure extend beyond immediate warmth or discomfort. Light carries energy that can influence the body in ways that are not always visible in the moment. Some of these effects are gradual, building over time as the skin continues to receive direct contact without the filtering layer that fur once provided. This creates a situation in which the body must manage not only temperature, but also the cumulative impact of repeated exposure. In many mammals, fur reduces the intensity of this interaction, limiting how much of that energy reaches the skin. In humans, the absence of such a barrier means that the skin itself must take on a more active role. Pigmentation becomes one of the ways this is managed, but it does not act alone. The structure of the skin, its thickness, and its ability to renew itself all contribute to how it responds to ongoing contact with the environment. These processes operate quietly, without drawing attention, but they are continuous. The surface of the body is not static, it is constantly being renewed, with older layers replaced by new ones in a cycle that helps maintain function over time. Returning again to earlier stages of human development, these adjustments would have been shaped by long periods of exposure across different environments. Groups living under stronger and more consistent sunlight would experience different pressures than those in regions with less direct exposure. Over many generations, these differences would influence how the skin responds, not through sudden change, but through gradual variation. This suggests that the human body did not find a single solution to the absence of fur. It developed a range of responses, each aligned with specific conditions. At the same time, the direct exposure of the skin introduces a form of sensitivity that cannot be entirely removed. The body remains affected by the intensity and duration of sunlight, as well as by changes in temperature. This creates a balance that must be maintained through both biological processes and behavior. Seeking shade, adjusting activity to different times of day, and modifying movement patterns all become part of how the body manages its relationship with the environment. These responses do not replace the functions of fur. They operate alongside the body's internal systems, forming a combined approach to managing exposure. If we consider again the broader pattern of human adaptation, this shift reflects a move toward a body that does not rely on a single protective layer, but on a network of responses that work together. The skin becomes more than a boundary. It becomes an active interface, one that must continuously adjust to conditions that change over time. This creates a form of resilience that is flexible, but not absolute. The body can manage a range of conditions, but it remains sensitive to extremes. The absence of fur, therefore, does not remove the influence of the environment. It brings that influence closer, making it a constant part of the body's experience. Within this framework, the human body becomes a system that responds to exposure through variation and adjustment, rather than through fixed protection. If the skin carries a greater share of protection in the absence of fur, then its limits become part of the body's daily experience, even when those limits are not immediately visible. Protection is no longer provided by a stable outer layer that remains unchanged across conditions. Instead, it depends on a set of processes that must continue to operate over time, each one shaped by exposure, movement, and the surrounding environment. This creates a form of stability that is active rather than fixed. It works as long as the conditions remain within a certain range, and it begins to strain when those conditions move beyond it. One of the most important aspects of this system is that it does not function independently of behavior. The body alone does not fully manage exposure. It relies on patterns of activity that align with the environment. When sunlight is strongest, reducing direct exposure becomes part of maintaining balance. When temperatures drop, conserving heat becomes more important. These adjustments do not require conscious awareness in every moment, but they shape how the body moves through time. Returning again to earlier stages of human development, such patterns would have emerged gradually, as individuals and groups interacted with their environments across many generations. There would be no single moment when the system was complete. Instead, it would have been refined slowly, through repeated cycles of exposure and response. The absence of fur, in this context, is not simply a condition to be managed. It becomes part of a larger relationship between the body and the environment, one that includes timing, movement, and the availability of shelter. At the same time, this relationship introduces a persistent form of vulnerability. The skin, while capable of adjusting, does not create a complete barrier. It remains open to influence, whether from light, temperature, or contact. Small changes can accumulate over time, affecting the body in ways that are gradual rather than immediate. This does not mean that the system fails, but it means that it operates within limits that must be respected. If those limits are exceeded, the body responds, often by reducing activity or seeking different conditions. This reinforces the idea that the human body, as it developed, did not move toward complete independence from its environment. It moved toward a different form of dependence, one that is more flexible but also more continuous. If we consider again the broader arc of human adaptation, this pattern suggests that the loss of fur was not resolved by a single compensatory change. It was integrated into a system that includes multiple layers of response, each addressing a different aspect of exposure. The skin manages direct contact. Circulation adjusts internal balance. Behavior modifies the timing and context of activity. Together, these elements create a body that can operate across a range of conditions, but only by remaining in constant interaction with its surroundings. This interaction is not always visible, but it is always present. The absence of fur, therefore, is not simply a missing feature. It is part of a structure that requires the body to remain engaged, adjusting continuously as conditions change. Within this structure, vulnerability and capability exist together, not as opposites, but as parts of the same system, shaping how the human body experiences the world over time. If the loss of fur increased exposure to sunlight and required the body to adjust through skin and behavior, it also changed how the body interacts with much smaller elements of the environment, ones that are not always visible but are constantly present. Among these are parasites, insects, and microorganisms that live on or near the surface of the body. In many mammals, dense fur creates a stable environment that can support these small organisms. The space between hairs provides shelter, warmth, and protection from external conditions. This does not mean that all fur-covered animals are heavily affected at all times, but it does create the possibility for parasites to remain close to the skin for extended periods. In such environments, small organisms can move, feed, and reproduce with limited disturbance. Removing or reducing that layer changes the conditions in which these organisms exist. An exposed surface offers fewer places to hide and fewer stable microenvironments. The skin is more directly influenced by air movement, temperature changes, and contact with the surroundings. This can make it more difficult for certain parasites to remain attached or to move freely across the body. At the same time, the absence of fur does not eliminate all forms of exposure. The skin remains accessible, and some organisms are able to adapt to these conditions. The change, therefore, is not absolute. It shifts the balance, rather than removing the interaction entirely. Returning again to earlier stages of human development, this shift would have taken place gradually, as the density of body hair decreased over generations. Each small change would alter the conditions for parasites in subtle ways. Over time, these changes could influence how frequently organisms remain on the body, how easily they spread, and how the body responds to their presence. This does not suggest a single cause for the loss of fur, but it introduces another layer to the broader pattern. The body is not only interacting with temperature and sunlight, but also with living organisms that respond to the same conditions. In more open environments, where early humans may have spent longer periods moving across the land, the interaction between body and environment becomes more dynamic. Airflow increases, surfaces change, and contact with different materials becomes more frequent. These factors can influence how organisms move between hosts and how long they remain in one place. A body with less fur may experience these interactions differently, not necessarily free from parasites but shaped by different conditions. At the same time, the reduction of fur introduces a new form of exposure. Without a protective layer, the skin may be more accessible to bites, irritation, and small injuries caused by contact with insects or environmental surfaces. This reinforces the idea that the change is not a simple improvement. It redistributes the types of challenges the body faces. Some pressures may be reduced, while others become more direct. If we consider again the broader pattern of human adaptation, this interaction with parasites and small organisms becomes part of the overall system. The body, the environment, and the organisms within it form a network of relationships that evolve together over time. The loss of fur within this network alters how these relationships are expressed. It does not remove them, but it changes their form. The human body becomes a surface that is more exposed, more variable, and more directly influenced by its surroundings. Within this context, the absence of fur can be seen as part of a broader shift, one that includes not only temperature and movement, but also the smaller, less visible interactions that shape the body's experience over long periods of time. If the reduction of fur altered how parasites interact with the body, then it also begins to shape how those interactions unfold across time, not only within a single individual but across groups and shared spaces. Parasites do not depend only on the presence of a host. They depend on continuity. They require conditions that allow them to remain, to move, and to transfer between bodies without interruption. In animals with dense fur, this continuity can be supported by the structure of the coat itself. Fur creates a layered environment where small organisms can remain protected from external changes such as wind, temperature shifts, or brief separation from the host. When individuals come into contact, whether through proximity, grooming, or shared resting areas, this layered structure can allow organisms to move from one body to another with relative ease. The process does not need to be rapid. It only needs to be possible within the conditions that exist. When fur is reduced, the nature of that continuity begins to change. The surface of the skin is more exposed, and the conditions for small organisms become less stable. Airflow reaches the surface more directly, temperature fluctuates more quickly, and there are fewer protected spaces where organisms can remain without interruption. This does not prevent all forms of parasitic interaction, but it alters the environment in which those interactions take place. Some organisms may find it more difficult to persist, while others may adapt to the new conditions. The balance shifts, rather than disappearing. Returning again to earlier stages of human development, the way individuals moved and gathered would have influenced how these interactions were maintained. Early humans did not live in isolation. They formed groups, shared spaces, and moved together across landscapes that changed over time. In such conditions, the transfer of organisms would depend not only on physical contact, but also on the structure of those interactions. A body with less fur presents a different surface, one where direct skin contact becomes more significant than movement through a protective layer. This changes how organisms move between hosts and how long they can remain outside the body during that transfer. At the same time, the absence of fur introduces a different form of exposure. The skin, while more open to environmental influence, is also more accessible to external irritants, including bites from insects. This creates a tension within the system. Some forms of parasitic persistence may be reduced, while other forms of contact may become more immediate. The body must respond to both, not by eliminating them, but by managing their effects over time. This response is not limited to the skin itself. It involves a broader set of processes that help maintain balance, even when the surface of the body is directly engaged with the environment. If we consider again the broader pattern of human adaptation, the loss of fur can be seen as part of a network of changes that influence how organisms interact with the body across time. It does not remove the presence of parasites, but it changes the conditions under which they survive, move, and spread. The human body becomes less of a stable habitat for certain organisms, while remaining open to others that can operate under more variable conditions. This creates a dynamic relationship, one that depends on movement, contact, and the environment rather than on a fixed structure. Within this relationship, the absence of fur is not a single solution. It is one factor among many, shaping how the body and the organisms around it coexist over long periods without settling into a single, unchanging pattern. If the reduction of fur changes how parasites live on the body and how they move between individuals, then it also begins to influence how the body responds over longer periods of time, not only through immediate reactions but through gradual adjustments that shape stability across generations. The presence of parasites is not always visible, and their effects are not always sudden. In many cases, they operate quietly, interacting with the surface of the body or drawing resources in small amounts over time. This creates a form of pressure that is continuous rather than intense. In animals with dense fur, this pressure can remain relatively stable because the environment in which parasites exist is also stable. The layered structure of fur provides consistent shelter, allowing certain organisms to persist with limited interruption. In humans, the absence of that structure introduces variability. The skin is more exposed to air, temperature shifts, and movement, and this exposure can disrupt the conditions that many organisms depend on. This does not eliminate the presence of parasites, but it changes how consistently they can remain attached or how easily they can maintain a stable position on the body. Returning again to earlier stages of human development, these changes would not have appeared suddenly. As body hair gradually decreased, the conditions for parasites would also have shifted gradually. Some organisms that depended on dense fur may have become less common, while others that could adapt to exposed skin may have become more relevant. This suggests that the relationship between the human body and these organisms did not disappear. It transformed over time, following the same slow pattern as the physical changes in the body itself. At the same time, the body's response to these interactions would have continued to operate in the background. The skin, as an active surface, can react to irritation, small injuries, and contact with external organisms. These responses do not always remove the source of irritation, but they contribute to maintaining a balance that allows the body to continue functioning. Over long periods, such interactions may influence how the body allocates its resources, how it repairs itself, and how it maintains stability in the presence of ongoing external pressures. If we consider again the environments in which early humans lived, the combination of movement, exposure, and group interaction would have created a dynamic setting for these processes. Individuals would encounter different conditions across time, and the organisms around them would respond to those conditions as well. The absence of fur, within this context, becomes part of a system that does not provide a fixed environment for parasites to remain unchanged. Instead, it creates a surface that is more variable, more exposed, and more influenced by movement and climate. This variability can disrupt certain patterns of persistence, even if it does not remove all forms of interaction. At the same time, the body remains open to new forms of exposure, requiring it to adjust continuously rather than relying on a single protective layer. This reinforces the idea that the loss of fur is not a complete solution to any one problem. It is part of a broader reorganization, where the body shifts from providing stable shelter to managing changing conditions. Within this system, the relationship between the human body and parasites becomes less fixed and more fluid, shaped by the same factors that influence temperature, movement, and exposure. The absence of fur, therefore, does not stand alone. It participates in a wider pattern, one in which the body and its environment remain in constant interaction, with no single element fully controlling the outcome over time. If the loss of fur changed how the human body manages temperature, exposure, and even its interaction with small organisms, then it also begins to shape how the body is seen by others of the same species. In most mammals, the surface of the body is partly hidden beneath fur. The color, texture, and subtle movements of the skin are less visible, and many signals are carried instead through posture, scent, or sound. Fur creates a kind of visual filter, softening the details that lie beneath it. In humans, that filter is largely absent. The skin is not only exposed to the environment, but also to the perception of other individuals. This creates a condition where small changes in the surface of the body become more visible and more meaningful. Color variations, changes in blood flow, and even slight shifts in expression can be seen directly without being obscured. This does not imply that the loss of fur occurred for the purpose of communication, but it introduces a context in which the exposed surface of the body can carry information in ways that are less available to fur-covered animals. Returning again to earlier stages of human development, as body hair gradually decreased, the visibility of the skin would have increased. This change would not have been immediate or uniform, but over many generations, it would allow for more direct observation of subtle signals. The movement of muscles beneath the skin, the flushing or paling of certain areas, and the presence of marks or changes in texture would all become part of what could be perceived by others. In social groups, where individuals live in close proximity and interact frequently, such visibility can influence how information is shared. It does not require deliberate signaling. It can occur as part of normal interaction, where the body reflects internal states that others can observe. At the same time, this increased visibility introduces a different form of exposure. The body is not only open to environmental conditions, but also to social interpretation. The surface of the skin becomes a space where biological processes and social perception meet. This does not create a single outcome, but it allows for a wider range of interactions. Some signals may be clear, while others remain subtle. The absence of fur does not determine how these signals are used, but it makes them more accessible. If we consider again the broader pattern of human adaptation, this shift suggests that the loss of fur is connected not only to physical processes, but also to the structure of social life. Early humans did not exist as isolated individuals. They formed groups, shared space, and relied on forms of coordination that extend beyond simple movement. In such settings, the ability to perceive and respond to others becomes important. The exposed skin, by making certain changes visible, may contribute to this process, even if it is not the sole factor. This does not mean that furless skin replaced other forms of communication. It became part of a system in which multiple channels operate together. The body, in this sense, is not only a biological structure, it is also a surface through which information can pass, shaped by both internal states and external conditions. Within this framework, the absence of fur takes on another dimension. It is not only about heat, protection, or exposure. It is also about visibility, about how the body appears and how it is perceived within a social environment that evolves alongside it over time. The exposed surface of the human body does more than receive sunlight or release heat. It also makes the body easier to read. In most mammals, fur covers much of what happens at the level of the skin. Small changes in color, tension, and blood flow remain partly hidden beneath that layer. The body can still communicate, but much of that communication must pass through movement, sound, posture, or scent. In humans, the situation is different. Because the skin is more visible, subtle physical changes can be noticed directly. A shift in circulation can alter tone or brightness. A small movement in the muscles of the face can become visible almost immediately. Even signs of strain, illness, youth, age, or recent activity may appear more clearly when the skin is not obscured by thick body hair. This does not prove that fur disappeared in order to make communication easier. That would go further than the evidence allows. But once the surface of the body became more visible, it likely changed what other humans could notice about one another in ordinary social life. Returning again to earlier stages of human development, this would not have happened all at once. The body did not move suddenly from full coverage to exposed skin. The change would have unfolded gradually across many generations, with each small reduction in body hair making the skin slightly more available to sight. Over time, this would increase the visibility of features that are still important in human interaction today. The face becomes easier to read when muscles beneath the skin are not hidden by dense fur. The condition of the skin can reflect environmental exposure, health, and physical effort. Slight flushing, paling, dryness, tension, or relaxation can all become part of what others observe, even without words. In small social groups, where people remain near one another for long periods, such visibility may shape trust, attention, caution, or care in quiet ways. It does not need to become formal signaling. It can simply become part of how one body responds to another. At the same time, visible skin does not offer clear or fixed information in every moment. What appears on the surface can be influenced by temperature, sunlight, wind, fear, fatigue, exertion, and many other conditions. This means the exposed body is not a simple display. It is a shifting surface where biology and circumstance meet. A warm environment can change circulation. Physical effort can change the appearance of the face and the skin. Injury or irritation can remain visible longer than it would in a heavily furred animal. These features make the human body easier to observe, but not always easier to interpret. The same visible change may have different causes in different settings. This matters because it reminds us that exposed skin did not create perfect transparency. It created greater visibility, and that visibility became part of social life. If we look again at the long history of early humans, group living would make this especially important. Human beings did not evolve as solitary bodies moving through empty land. They existed within groups, across generations, with repeated contact, shared rest, coordinated movement, and mutual dependence. In that setting, the body is never only a biological structure. It is also something others learn to watch. A more visible face may support richer expression. More visible skin may allow others to notice stress, weakness, recovery, maturity, or change. None of this needs to be exaggerated into a single explanation for furlessness. It is enough to see that once fur was reduced, the body became more socially legible than before. The skin no longer served only as a physical boundary between the organism and the environment. It also became part of the space where human relationships unfolded. In this way, the loss of fur may have had consequences beyond temperature and movement. It may have slowly widened the range of information available in ordinary human contact, making the body not only more exposed to the world, but more visible to one another as well. If the exposed surface of the human body made subtle changes more visible, then over longer periods of time, this visibility would not remain neutral. It would become part of how individuals are noticed, remembered, and responded to within a group. In most mammals, the outer appearance is shaped largely by fur patterns, size, and movement. These features are important, but they do not change quickly. The body presents a relatively stable surface, and many short-term conditions remain hidden beneath it. In humans, the absence of dense fur creates a surface that is more variable. The skin reflects not only long-term traits but also short-term states. Fatigue, illness, recovery, stress, and physical effort can all leave traces that are visible, even if only slightly. Over time, this creates a body that does not simply exist in space, but one that changes in ways others can observe. Returning again to earlier stages of human development, this would have taken place gradually, as body hair decreased and the skin became more consistently exposed. Each generation would carry only small differences, but over long periods, these differences would accumulate into a new condition. In that condition, the body becomes easier to observe in detail. The face, in particular, would take on a larger role. Without thick fur, small muscle movements become more visible. Expressions can form and change more clearly. This does not mean that communication depends entirely on the face, but it suggests that visual signals may become more precise. At the same time, the rest of the body also becomes part of this visible system. Marks, injuries, changes in tone, and signs of aging remain on the surface in ways that are not hidden. This creates a continuity between past and present states of the body, where traces of earlier conditions can still be seen. Such visibility does not guarantee understanding. The body may show signs, but interpreting them depends on context. Still, within small groups that share time and space, repeated observation allows patterns to be recognized. Individuals may learn to associate certain visible changes with certain conditions, even if those associations are not always exact. This creates a form of awareness that is built slowly, through experience rather than through fixed signals. If we consider again the broader pattern of human adaptation, this increased visibility may have influenced how individuals relate to one another. A body that reveals more about its condition may support forms of attention, care, or caution that depend on observation. This does not require deliberate signaling. It can arise from the simple fact that more information is available on the surface. At the same time, this exposure also creates a different kind of vulnerability. The body is not only open to environmental forces, but also to social perception. Visible differences can be noticed, compared, and remembered. This adds another layer to the absence of fur. The body is no longer protected by a covering that conceals variation. It is presented more directly, with all the changes that occur over time. Within this framework, the loss of fur is not only about heat, movement, or protection. It also reshapes how the body exists within a social environment. The skin becomes a shared surface of perception, where biological processes and social awareness meet. Over long periods, this may not provide a single advantage, but it changes the conditions under which individuals interact. The human body becomes more readable, but also more exposed, not only to the natural world, but to the attention of others. If the human body became more exposed and more dependent on active regulation, then at some point, that dependence would begin to extend beyond biology alone. The body does not exist in isolation. It moves through an environment that can be modified, and over time, early humans began to alter that environment in ways that changed how the body experienced exposure. One of the most important of these changes is the use of external materials to create a layer that the body itself no longer provides. This layer does not grow from the skin. It is made, adjusted, and replaced. It can be removed when not needed and added when conditions require it. This introduces a new form of protection, one that is not fixed within the body but exists outside of it. In many animals, protection is largely built into the body. Fur, fat, and other features remain constant regardless of immediate conditions. In humans, the absence of dense fur creates a space where external solutions become more relevant. Coverings made from plant fibers, animal skins, or other materials can provide insulation, reduce exposure to wind, and limit direct contact with the environment. These coverings do not operate in exactly the same way as fur, but they can fulfill some of the same roles when needed. The key difference is that they are not always present. They depend on choice, availability, and the ability to create and maintain them. Returning again to earlier stages of human development, the emergence of such external coverings would not have been immediate or uniform. It would have developed gradually, alongside other changes in behavior and environment. Early humans moving through different climates would encounter conditions that require different forms of protection. In colder regions, maintaining warmth becomes more difficult without fur, and the use of coverings would become more important. In warmer regions, exposure to sunlight and environmental elements might require different adjustments. This suggests that the loss of fur did not leave the body without protection. It shifted the source of protection from internal to external systems. At the same time, this shift introduces a new kind of dependence. The body is no longer fully equipped on its own to manage all conditions. It relies on tools, materials, and knowledge that must be maintained across time. This creates a relationship between the body and its environment that is more flexible, but also more complex. Protection is no longer constant. It must be created, adapted, and sometimes repaired. If we consider again the broader pattern of human adaptation, this marks a significant transition. The body is no longer the only site of adaptation. External objects begin to carry part of that role. The absence of fur, in this context, becomes part of a system where biological and cultural elements interact. The body provides certain capacities, while external materials extend or modify those capacities depending on the situation. This does not remove vulnerability, but it changes how vulnerability is managed. The human body becomes part of a larger system that includes not only biological processes, but also learned behaviors and shared practices. Within this system, the loss of fur is not simply compensated. It is integrated into a way of living that allows the body to function across a wider range of environments, even as it remains dependent on conditions that extend beyond itself. If external coverings begin to take on some of the roles once provided by fur, then the nature of protection itself changes in a fundamental way. Protection is no longer fixed within the body, present at all times regardless of condition. It becomes something that can be added, removed, adjusted, or even shared. This flexibility allows the human body to operate across environments that would otherwise be difficult to endure without a natural insulating layer. At the same time, it introduces a dependence that did not exist in the same form for other mammals. The body must now rely on materials, on knowledge of how to use them, and on the continuity of that knowledge across generations. Without these elements, the absence of fur becomes more noticeable, especially in environments that place strong demands on the body. Returning again to earlier stages of human development, the use of coverings would likely have emerged alongside other forms of environmental modification. Fire, for example, changes how heat is managed, reducing the need for constant insulation during periods of rest. Shelters alter exposure to wind and temperature, creating spaces where the body can recover from environmental stress. Coverings, in this broader system, become one part of a network of adjustments that extend the body's ability to remain stable. None of these elements alone replaces fur entirely, but together they form an alternative system of protection that operates outside the body itself. This system is not permanent in the same way as fur. It depends on context. A covering can be worn during cold conditions and removed when it is no longer needed. It can be changed as environments shift, allowing the body to adapt more quickly than biological evolution alone would permit. This creates a form of flexibility that is not available to most other mammals, whose protective features are largely fixed once developed. At the same time, this flexibility comes with limits. External materials must be maintained. They can wear out, become damaged, or be lost. Knowledge of how to create and use them must be preserved and passed on. This introduces a form of continuity that is cultural rather than biological. The body's ability to function becomes linked not only to its physical structure, but to practices that exist beyond it. If we consider again the broader pattern of human adaptation, this shift represents more than a simple replacement of one feature with another. It marks a transition in how adaptation itself occurs. The body no longer carries all of its protective features within its own structure. Some of those features are moved into the environment, where they can be shaped by experience and adjusted over time. The absence of fur, in this context, becomes part of a system that allows the human body to operate in conditions that would otherwise be restrictive. It does not eliminate the need for protection, but it changes where that protection comes from and how it is maintained. The human body becomes part of a larger network that includes tools, materials, and shared knowledge, all of which contribute to its ability to remain stable across changing environments. Within this network, the loss of fur is not simply a deficit. It is part of a broader reorganization, one that shifts the balance between biological structure and external support, allowing the body to adapt in ways that extend beyond its own physical form. If protection can be created outside the body, then over time the boundary between the body and the environment begins to shift in a subtle but lasting way. The body no longer carries all of its necessary features within itself. Instead, it becomes part of a system that extends outward, where tools, materials, and constructed spaces take on roles that were once handled by biological structures alone. This does not happen all at once. It develops gradually, as early humans begin to rely more consistently on objects that can be shaped and used according to need. In this process, the absence of fur does not stand as a gap waiting to be filled in a single way. It becomes one of the conditions that allows external solutions to become more central to survival. Returning again to earlier stages of human development, this shift would have been influenced by the environments in which different groups lived. In colder regions, maintaining warmth without fur would require more consistent use of coverings and shelter. In warmer regions, protection from sunlight or from contact with the ground and vegetation might take different forms. These adjustments would not be identical across all populations, but they would share a common pattern. The body, rather than remaining fully self-sufficient, begins to depend on a wider set of supports that can be modified over time. This introduces a form of adaptation that does not rely solely on changes in the body itself. It allows responses to occur within a single lifetime, rather than across many generations. At the same time, this dependence on external systems creates a new type of vulnerability. If the materials or knowledge required to create protection are lost, the body is left more exposed than that of an animal whose protection is built into its structure. This reinforces the idea that the shift is not simply an improvement, but a rebalancing. Stability is no longer guaranteed by a fixed biological layer. It must be maintained through ongoing interaction with the environment and with other members of the group. Knowledge becomes as important as physical structure. The ability to create, repair, and share protective materials becomes part of what allows the body to function within a given range of conditions. If we consider again the broader pattern of human adaptation, this transition marks a point where biology and culture begin to overlap more directly. The body provides certain capacities, such as the ability to regulate temperature through sweating, while external systems provide additional layers of support that can be adjusted as needed. Together, these elements create a flexible system that can respond to changing environments without requiring immediate biological change. Within this system, the absence of fur is not simply replaced. It is incorporated into a new way of existing, one in which the body is no longer the sole site of adaptation. Instead, adaptation extends into the environment, where it can be shaped, modified, and passed on through shared experience. The human body becomes part of a larger structure that includes both biological processes and external supports, each influencing the other over time. This creates a form of existence that is not fully contained within the body, but distributed across the relationship between the body, the environment, and the practices that connect them. If the human body no longer carries all of its protection within itself, and if external systems begin to take on that role, then the relationship between the body and the environment becomes more layered than it first appears. Protection is no longer a constant feature that exists at all times. It becomes something that must be created, maintained, and remembered. This introduces a quiet but important shift. The body is not only shaped by its own structure, but also by patterns that extend beyond it, patterns that depend on repetition, learning, and continuity across time. In this setting, the absence of fur is not simply a physical condition. It becomes part of a broader system in which survival depends not only on what the body is, but on what the body knows and what it can do with that knowledge. Returning again to earlier stages of human development, this shift would have unfolded slowly. Early humans did not suddenly replace biological protection with external solutions. Instead, small adjustments accumulated. A piece of material used to cover part of the body, a place chosen for shelter that reduced exposure to wind, a fire maintained long enough to provide warmth beyond the immediate moment. Each of these actions, repeated over time, begins to form a pattern. That pattern does not exist in the body alone. It exists in behavior, in memory, and in the shared experience of the group. This means that the ability to remain stable in changing environments is no longer limited to biological inheritance. It becomes linked to what is learned and preserved. At the same time, this introduces a new kind of dependence. The body is no longer fully equipped on its own to manage all conditions. It relies on external elements that must be actively maintained. Fire must be kept burning or relit. Coverings must be repaired or replaced. Shelters must be constructed and used effectively. If these elements are lost, the body becomes more exposed than before. This creates a form of vulnerability that is different from the one created by the loss of fur itself. It is not only about exposure to the environment, but about the continuity of the systems that reduce that exposure. If we consider again the broader pattern of human adaptation, this suggests that the body becomes part of a network that extends through time. Knowledge is passed from one generation to the next, allowing each new individual to begin with more than the body alone provides. This does not happen instantly. It requires repetition, observation, and the ability to retain information. Over long periods, this process creates a form of stability that is not fixed in the body, but distributed across the group. The absence of fur, in this context, becomes part of a system that depends on this distribution. The body does not carry all of its protection within its skin. It carries the capacity to learn, to remember, and to apply what has been learned. At the same time, this system remains sensitive to disruption. If knowledge is not preserved, or if conditions change faster than they can be understood, the body must respond without the full support of these external systems. This reinforces the idea that the shift is not a simple improvement. It is a reorganization that creates both new capacities and new forms of dependence. Within this framework, the loss of fur is not an isolated change. It is connected to the emergence of a way of living in which the body and its environment are linked through memory, practice, and shared experience. The human body becomes not only a biological structure, but part of a continuous process, one that extends beyond the individual and connects each generation to those that came before, shaping how exposure is managed across time rather than in a single moment. If the human body depends on learned behavior and shared knowledge to manage exposure, then this dependence extends beyond individual actions into the structure of the group itself. Protection is no longer something each body carries in isolation. It becomes something that is maintained collectively, through repeated practices that are observed, imitated, and refined over time. In this setting, the absence of fur does not affect only one individual at a time. It shapes how individuals rely on one another, how they organize their time, and how they share space. Returning again to earlier stages of human development, groups would have formed around patterns of movement and rest that reflect both environmental conditions and the needs of the body. Fire is not maintained by one person alone for long periods. Shelter is not always constructed by a single individual. Knowledge about materials, timing, and location would circulate within the group, allowing multiple individuals to contribute to maintaining the conditions that reduce exposure. This creates a form of protection that is distributed. No single body holds all of it. Instead, it exists in the interactions between individuals, in the routines that are repeated, and in the memory that is shared. At the same time, this distribution introduces a new kind of structure. The group must remain coordinated enough for these systems to function. If individuals become separated, or if knowledge is not transmitted effectively, the system weakens. The body, without fur, becomes more sensitive to such disruptions. This suggests that the loss of fur may have reinforced patterns of social dependence, not as a single cause, but as part of a broader alignment between biology and social organization. The body alone is not sufficient. It relies on others and on the continuity of shared practices. If we consider again the environments in which early humans lived, the need to move across landscapes, to respond to changing conditions, and to manage exposure over time would have required coordination. Individuals would need to align their actions, not only to access resources, but to maintain the systems that protect them from environmental stress. This does not imply a fixed structure or a uniform way of living, but it suggests that group interaction becomes part of how the body remains stable. The absence of fur, in this context, contributes to a condition where isolation carries greater cost. The body is more exposed, and without access to shared systems, its ability to manage that exposure is reduced. At the same time, this form of dependence does not remove individual variation. Each body still responds differently to conditions, but the range within which those differences can be managed is influenced by the presence of the group. This creates a balance between individual capacity and collective support. If we consider again the broader pattern of human adaptation, this suggests that the shift from biological protection to external systems is also a shift towards social integration. The body becomes part of a network where survival is linked not only to physical features, but to relationships and shared practices. Within this network, the loss of fur is not simply compensated. It is woven into a system where protection, knowledge, and coordination are maintained together. The human body, in this sense, does not stand alone against the environment. It exists within a structure that extends beyond itself, where the conditions for stability are created and preserved through interaction over time. If protection, warmth, and exposure are managed not only by the body but by shared systems and coordinated behavior, then over longer periods of time, this arrangement begins to change what it means for the human body to fit within an environment. In most mammals, the body is closely aligned with a specific range of conditions. Fur thickness, body size, and internal regulation all correspond to the environments in which the species lives. Movement outside of that range is limited, unless the body itself changes across many generations. In humans, the situation becomes different. The body does not remain fixed within a narrow set of environmental limits. Instead, it extends its range through the use of external systems that can be adjusted more quickly than biological traits. This creates a condition where the body is no longer defined only by its physical structure, but by its ability to operate within systems that exist beyond it. Returning again to earlier stages of human development, this shift would have unfolded gradually, as groups moved into new regions and encountered conditions that differed from those in which earlier adaptations had formed. In colder environments, the absence of fur would make exposure more immediate, requiring consistent use of coverings, shelter, and controlled heat sources. In warmer environments, the same body might rely more heavily on shade, timing of activity, and the management of water. These responses are not built into the body in the same way as fur. They must be applied, maintained, and adapted as conditions change. This means that the human body does not simply match its environment. It participates in shaping the conditions under which it can function. At the same time, this expanded range introduces a new form of complexity. The body can operate across a wider variety of environments, but only if the systems that support it remain intact. If those systems are disrupted, the body is left more exposed than a mammal whose protection is built into its form. This reinforces the idea that the shift is not a simple expansion of capability, but a reorganization that creates both flexibility and dependence. The absence of fur, in this context, becomes part of a system that allows the body to move beyond the limits set by its biological structure, while also tying its survival to conditions that must be actively maintained. If we consider again the broader pattern of human adaptation, this suggests that the human body is no longer fully defined by natural selection, acting on physical traits alone. It is also shaped by the systems that individuals create and sustain together. Over time, these systems become more complex, allowing the body to function in environments that differ greatly from those in which earlier changes occurred. The loss of fur, therefore, is not simply a feature of the body. It is part of a larger transformation, one in which the boundary between the body and its environment becomes less fixed. The human body becomes capable of existing across a wider range of conditions, not because it carries all necessary protections within itself, but because it is embedded within systems that extend beyond it. Within this framework, the absence of fur is not an endpoint. It is a step within a longer process, one that continues to shape how the human body relates to the world over time. If the human body extends beyond its biological limits, through shared systems and learned practices, then over time, the boundary between what is natural and what is constructed becomes less clear. The body no longer exists only as something shaped by slow biological change. It becomes part of a layered system in which the environment itself is gradually modified to match the needs of the body. This does not happen suddenly, and it does not replace biological adaptation entirely. Instead, it adds another dimension, where the surroundings are adjusted in ways that reduce the pressures the body would otherwise face. In this context, the absence of fur becomes part of a larger condition, one in which the body is no longer expected to carry all of its protection within its own structure. Returning again to earlier stages of human development, this shift would have been subtle at first. A place chosen for rest might offer more protection from wind. A fire maintained through the night would extend warmth beyond what the body alone could produce. Over time, these small adjustments begin to accumulate. Spaces become more consistently used. Materials are arranged with intention. Patterns of behavior repeat in ways that gradually reshape the immediate environment. The body, in turn, begins to rely on these modifications, not as occasional support, but as part of its normal condition. This creates a feedback loop, where the body influences the environment, and the environment supports the body in return. At the same time, this process introduces a different kind of stability. In animals whose protection is built into their bodies, stability comes from consistency in physical form. In humans, stability begins to emerge from consistency in behavior and in the structures that behavior creates. This does not eliminate variation, but it allows certain conditions to be maintained across time, even as external environments change. The absence of fur in this system is not corrected by a new biological feature. It is accommodated by a set of practices that reduce the need for that feature to exist in the same way. If we consider again the broader pattern of human adaptation, this suggests that the body is no longer the only site where survival is determined. The environment itself becomes part of that process. Shelter, fire, and other modifications act as extensions of the body's ability to regulate temperature and reduce exposure. These extensions are not permanent in the way that fur is. They require maintenance, coordination, and the continued presence of knowledge. This creates a form of dependence that is both flexible and fragile. The body can operate under a wider range of conditions, but only as long as the systems that support it remain intact. At the same time, this arrangement allows for a level of variation that is not available through biological change alone. Different groups can develop different ways of managing exposure, depending on the environments they inhabit. This means that the absence of fur does not lead to a single uniform solution. It leads to a range of responses, each shaped by local conditions and shared practices. The human body, in this sense, becomes part of a distributed system, where survival depends on the interaction between biology, environment, and learned behavior. Within this system, the loss of fur is not a problem that needs to be solved in one way. It is a condition that is managed through many overlapping processes, each contributing to how the body remains stable across time. If the environment begins to be shaped in ways that support the human body, then over time, these changes do more than reduce immediate exposure. They begin to alter how the body experiences the world on a daily basis. The wind that once moved freely across open space can be slowed by constructed barriers. The temperature that once shifted sharply between day and night can be moderated within enclosed spaces. Surfaces that once caused discomfort or injury can be covered or arranged to reduce their impact. These changes do not remove the natural environment, but they reshape how it is encountered. The body is still present within that environment, but the conditions it experiences are no longer entirely determined by external forces. Returning again to earlier stages of human development, these adjustments would have emerged through repeated interaction with the same spaces. A place used for rest becomes more stable over time. Materials are gathered and arranged in ways that reflect past experience. Knowledge about how to position a shelter, how to maintain warmth, or how to reduce exposure to elements would be refined through observation and repetition. This creates a continuity that extends beyond the individual. Each generation inherits not only a body, but also a set of practices that influence how that body interacts with its surroundings. The absence of fur in this context becomes less immediately limiting because the environment itself is adjusted to compensate for it. At the same time, this process introduces a gradual shift in how the body relates to natural conditions. Instead of adapting only through internal changes, the body begins to rely on external modifications that can be altered more quickly. This allows for flexibility, but it also changes the nature of dependence. The body becomes less directly exposed to certain conditions, but more dependent on the systems that provide that protection. If those systems fail or are absent, the body may be more vulnerable than one that retains a built-in protective layer. This reinforces the idea that the shift is not simply an improvement, but a reconfiguration of how stability is achieved. If we consider again the broader pattern of human adaptation, this suggests that the human body operates within an environment that is partially constructed. The boundary between the organism and its surroundings becomes less distinct. Shelter, fire, and arranged materials function as extensions of the body's ability to regulate itself. These extensions are not fixed. They can change as conditions change, allowing the body to remain within a workable range even when the external environment varies. Within this system, the loss of fur is not reversed or replaced in a direct way. Instead, it is integrated into a broader framework in which protection is distributed across both biological and external elements. The body no longer carries all of its defenses within its own structure. It shares that role with the environment it helps create. This creates a form of interaction that is continuous, where the body and its surroundings influence each other over time. The absence of fur, therefore, is not simply a feature of the body. It is part of a relationship, one in which the environment becomes an active participant in maintaining balance, rather than a passive background against which the body must adapt. If the environment is gradually shaped to support the human body, then over long periods of time, this process begins to influence not only how the body survives, but how it develops within those conditions. A body that is consistently protected by external systems may no longer face the same pressures that shaped earlier biological adaptations. This does not mean that evolution stops, but it suggests that the direction of pressure begins to shift. Instead of the environment acting directly on the body at all times, the environment is filtered through layers that humans themselves create. Shelter reduces exposure to wind and temperature. Fire provides warmth beyond what the body can produce. Coverings adjust how the skin interacts with the surrounding air. Together, these elements form a buffer, not as constant as fur, but adjustable and responsive to need. Returning again to earlier stages of human development, this buffering would not have been complete or consistent. Early shelters would offer limited protection. Fire would not always be available or maintained. Coverings would vary in effectiveness, depending on materials and conditions. The body would still experience exposure, but not in the same continuous way as before. Over time, as these systems become more reliable, the body spends more time within controlled conditions and less time directly exposed to the full range of environmental pressures. This creates a subtle shift. The body is no longer shaped only by what it can endure on its own. It is shaped by what the surrounding system allows it to endure. At the same time, this shift introduces a different form of continuity. The environment, once variable and unpredictable, begins to include elements that remain stable across time. A constructed space can be used repeatedly. A method of maintaining fire can be passed from one generation to the next. Techniques for creating coverings can be refined and shared. This continuity allows the body to function within a narrow range of conditions, even when the external environment remains variable. The absence of fur, in this context, becomes less immediately limiting, because the body is no longer fully exposed to those variations. However, this does not remove all forms of pressure. It changes how those pressures are experienced. Instead of acting directly on the body at all times, they act through the systems that humans create. If those systems fail, the body must respond without them. This introduces a new kind of vulnerability, one that is linked not only to physical exposure, but to the reliability of the environment that has been constructed. If we consider again the broader pattern of human adaptation, this suggests that the human body exists within a layered environment. The outer layer remains the natural world, with its variability and change. Within that, there are constructed layers that modify how the body experiences those conditions. These layers are not permanent. They require maintenance, knowledge, and coordination. The body, therefore, becomes part of a system that extends beyond its own boundaries, one that includes both biological processes and external structures. The loss of fur, in this framework, is not simply compensated. It is absorbed into a way of living where protection is distributed across multiple levels. The body no longer carries all of its defenses within its own form. It relies on a surrounding structure that must remain active and continuous. Over time, this creates a condition where the human body is not fully separated from nature, but also not fully defined by it. It exists within a space that is partly shaped by its own actions and partly shaped by forces beyond its control. Within this space, the absence of fur becomes one part of a larger pattern, one that reflects how humans adapt not only by changing themselves, but by changing the world around them. If the human body has become part of a system that extends beyond its own physical boundaries, then it becomes necessary to step back and consider what this means for the original question. The loss of fur is no longer only a biological event that can be explained by a single change or a single advantage. It is part of a longer process in which the body shifts from being fully defined by its own structure to being supported by layers that exist outside of it. These layers are not fixed. They are created, maintained, and adjusted over time, forming a system that interacts continuously with the body itself. In this context, the absence of fur does not stand alone. It exists within a network of changes that together make that absence possible. Returning again to earlier stages of human development, the reduction of fur would have unfolded gradually across many generations, alongside changes in environment, movement, and physiology. Early human ancestors did not begin without body hair. They were more similar to other primates, carrying a covering that provided insulation and protection. Over time, as conditions shifted, this covering became less dense. At the same time, other features began to take on greater importance. The body developed a more active system for releasing heat through sweating. Movement patterns extended across longer distances, often under conditions of direct sunlight. The skin itself became more involved in managing exposure, adjusting through pigmentation and continuous renewal. Each of these changes does not fully replace what was lost, but together they create a different balance. This balance does not eliminate vulnerability. It redistributes it across multiple systems that must operate together. If we consider again the broader pattern of human adaptation, the absence of fur begins to appear less like a simple loss and more like a point within a larger transition. The body gives up a constant insulating layer, but gains a more dynamic way of regulating temperature. It becomes more exposed to environmental conditions, but also more responsive to them. At the same time, it begins to rely on behaviors and external supports that can be adjusted more quickly than biological traits. Fire, shelter, and coverings do not grow from the body, but they extend its ability to function within a range of conditions that would otherwise be difficult to endure. This creates a system where the body is no longer the only site of adaptation. Adaptation is distributed across both biological processes and external elements that can be shaped over time. However, this distribution introduces a different kind of dependence. The body is no longer fully self-contained. It relies on access to resources, on knowledge that must be preserved, and on the presence of others who share and maintain that knowledge. Without these elements, the absence of fur becomes more significant, especially in environments that place strong demands on temperature regulation. This suggests that the human body is not simply more flexible than that of other mammals. It is flexible within a system that must remain intact for that flexibility to function. If we return again to the environments in which early humans lived, the combination of open landscapes, variable temperatures, and dispersed resources would have created conditions where no single adaptation would be sufficient on its own. The ability to release heat, to move over longer distances, to adjust behavior based on time of day, and to use external materials all contribute to a pattern that allows the body to remain stable. The loss of fur in this context is not driven by one factor, but supported by many. It becomes sustainable because it is embedded within this pattern, rather than because it provides a complete advantage by itself. Over long periods of time, this pattern continues to develop, External systems become more refined, knowledge becomes more structured and more widely shared. The environment, in some cases, becomes increasingly shaped by human activity. Within this evolving system, the absence of fur remains a constant feature, carried forward not because it is ideal in every situation, but because the surrounding system allows it to persist. This leads to a broader understanding of the human body. It is not simply an organism defined by its own physical traits. It is part of a network that includes environment, behavior, and shared knowledge. The loss of fur, when viewed in isolation, may appear as a disadvantage, but when placed within this network, it becomes one element in a system that allows the human body to operate across a wide range of conditions. This does not resolve the question into a single answer. Instead, it reveals that the answer lies in the interaction of many factors, none of which alone would be enough, but all of which together create a condition in which the absence of fur can remain, generation after generation, as part of what defines the human form. If the absence of fur can persist only within a network of conditions, then it becomes important to consider what that persistence reveals about the human body itself. The body is not simply stronger or weaker than that of other animals. It is organized differently. It does not rely on a single protective layer that remains constant across all situations. Instead, it depends on the coordination of multiple systems, each of which contributes in a limited way. Temperature is regulated through sweating and circulation. Exposure to sunlight is managed through pigmentation and behavior. Protection from the environment is extended through shelter, coverings, and controlled heat. None of these elements is complete on its own. They form a pattern in which stability is achieved through interaction rather than through a single dominant feature. Returning again to earlier stages of human development, this pattern would have required continuity across generations. The body alone does not carry all the information needed to maintain this balance. It relies on practices that must be repeated and remembered. The use of fire, the construction of shelter, and the creation of coverings are not inherited in the same way as biological traits. They are learned. This introduces a form of dependence that is less visible but deeply influential. The body's ability to function within a given range of conditions becomes linked to the preservation of knowledge. If that knowledge is interrupted, the body is left with fewer means of managing exposure. This suggests that the human body is not only shaped by natural selection acting on physical traits, but also by the continuity of learned behavior that supports those traits. At the same time, this arrangement creates a different kind of flexibility. Because external systems can be adjusted within a single lifetime, the body is not limited to waiting for gradual biological change. It can respond more quickly to shifts in environment, as long as the necessary knowledge and materials are available. This allows the human body to exist in a wider range of conditions than would be possible if it relied only on built-in features like fur. However, this flexibility is not absolute. It depends on access to resources, on the ability to coordinate with others, and on the stability of the systems that support it. If we consider again the broader pattern of human adaptation, this reveals a balance that is not immediately obvious. The body becomes more capable in some ways, but also more dependent in others. The loss of fur removes a constant layer of protection, but it opens the possibility for a system that can be modified and extended. This system is not fixed. It must be maintained continuously. It can fail, and when it does, the body is exposed in ways that reflect the absence of its original protection. This reinforces the idea that the human body is not a complete solution in itself. It is part of a process that includes both strengths and vulnerabilities, each shaped by the same set of changes. If we return to the question of why humans lost their fur while other animals kept theirs, the answer remains distributed across multiple factors. It cannot be reduced to a single cause or a single advantage. It reflects a shift in how the body relates to its environment, how it manages heat and exposure, and how it relies on systems that extend beyond its own structure. Within this shift, the absence of fur becomes not only a biological feature, but a sign of a deeper transformation. The human body becomes something that is not fully defined by what it carries, but by how it interacts, adapts, and persists within a world that it both inhabits and gradually reshapes. If the human body is no longer fully defined by what it carries within itself, then the question of loss begins to change its meaning. Losing fur is not only about what disappeared from the surface of the body, It is also about what took its place, not as a single feature, but as a way of existing that unfolds across time. The human body does not return to a previous state. It does not grow back the layer that once covered it. Instead, it continues forward, carrying the absence as part of its structure, and building around that absence through processes that extend beyond the skin. Returning again to earlier stages of human development, this path was never direct. The reduction of fur did not happen because it was the best solution in every situation. It remained because, within a changing set of conditions, it did not prevent survival. Other changes, unfolding alongside it, allowed the body to remain within a workable range. Heat could be released more effectively. Movement could continue for longer periods under certain conditions. The environment could be adjusted through fire, shelter, and coverings. Social structures allowed knowledge to persist and spread. None of these changes removed the challenges of exposure. They redistributed them, placing the body in a different relationship with its surroundings. Over time, this relationship became more complex. The body no longer stands alone against the environment. It exists within layers of interaction where biological processes, behavior, and constructed systems all contribute to stability. If one layer weakens, the others must respond. If the environment becomes more demanding, the system must adjust. This creates a form of balance that is not fixed, but constantly maintained. The absence of fur, in this context, is not a mistake waiting to be corrected. It is part of a structure that depends on continuous interaction rather than permanent protection. At the same time, this structure carries a quiet tension. The human body is capable of functioning across a wide range of conditions, but only when the systems around it remain intact. Without shelter, without knowledge, without coordination, the body is more exposed than that of many other animals. This does not make it weaker in a simple sense. It makes it dependent in a different way. The body is not protected by what it is alone, but by what it does, and by what it shares with others. If we return to the original question, why humans lost their fur while other animals kept theirs, the answer does not resolve into a single cause. Other animals remain within patterns where their bodies continue to provide what they need directly. Their fur remains because it continues to serve its role within their way of living. Humans, over time, moved into a different pattern, one where the body and the environment are linked through layers of adjustment. In that pattern, the presence of fur became less necessary, not because it had no value, but because other systems began to carry some of its functions. The loss, therefore, is not complete. It is transformed. What was once held within the body is now distributed across a wider system. And within that system, the human body remains what it has always been, not fully protected, not fully independent, but part of an ongoing balance between exposure and adaptation. If that balance were to change again, if the systems that support the body were to weaken or disappear, would the absence that once seemed sustainable begin to feel like a loss once more, in a way that cannot easily be reversed?